Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Marshall. I'm president of the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington. And thanks for tuning in to today's webinar on Charter Schools at 30, Reinventing Public Education. This is co-sponsored by PPI and the 74, our good partner and great website that I hope everybody's reading on education. And what we wanted to do is to commemorate a very important date. This is the 30th anniversary of the very first public charter school law to pass in the United States in 1991 in Minnesota. And we thought we'd mark the occasion by gathering pioneers and present leaders of the charter movement to reflect on where we go from here. I should say that PPI has been advocating for charters even before the idea, the concept had a name. Started in 1990 when David Osborne introduced me to Ted Coldery, one of the key architects of the public school choice experiment in Minnesota. And back in those days, that really meant open enrollment. So that if you were not satisfied with the neighborhood school, you could send your child to a school in another district, which was nice in theory, difficult sometimes logistically to do. Ted's idea was that we should allow other entities other than the school board to create new public schools anywhere they were needed, bring the schools to the people and to the communities where they were desperately needed. So Ted and I collaborated on a PPI paper that called for withdrawing the exclusive franchise that the school districts had on owning and operating public schools. And then Ted teamed up with one of our favorite people. That was then State Senator Ember Reichgott of Minnesota. Ember's with us today and is a dear friend of ours. She wrote the very first charter school bill in Minnesota, steered it through the legislature in 91. It was tough going. And that story is dramatically told in her book, Zero Chance of Passage. So Ember, thank you so much for joining us. The idea then spread to other states, California, Colorado, and others, and PPI cheerleading and working to drum up, national political support for the movement. We managed to get the attention of former Arkansas governor, Bill Clinton, who was then chairing the Democratic Leadership Council to which we were allied. And he saw the charter idea as a progressive alternative to vouchers, a way that would enable disadvantaged and minority parents to choose better schools. And so the idea of public school choice and charters became emblematic of the new democratic innovations that Clinton ran on the next year, 92. And it was really Bill Clinton, I think we have to say, that made charters a national movement. And of course, he created the first federal program after he won. Now, charters have had their ups and downs down the years. There have been plenty of failures and some great successes, but the evidence is now clear that where charters work best, where they're strongly authorized, they're outperforming traditional school districts when it comes to educating disadvantaged and minority kids in cities like New Orleans, here in Washington, D.C., in Denver, Newark, Indianapolis. We're seeing charter and charter-like schools really perform very strongly. Now, none of this came about easily. There were bruising political battles with central school bureaucracies and with the teachers' unions, which unfortunately have, continued to this day. But we're not here to sort of wallow in nostalgia for the past. We're really here to ask, what have we learned over the last 3 decades of public school choice and innovation about how to replicate the successes we've seen in the best charter sectors at scale all over the country? PPI's Reinventing America's Schools project, until recently run by David Osborne, has documented the emergence of what we're calling a new model or new way of organizing public schools, growing out of the best experiences, most effective charter sectors and innovation school sectors around the country. And our aim is to move the whole K through 12 system toward the formula that's worked in those districts: more school autonomy, more diverse curricula tailored to different learning styles, and more public accountability for results. We call this the 21st century school model. We think it better reflects how people live and work and learn in the information age. And I think we have to say again, we wouldn't be here talking about a new vision for organizing public education Were it not for Bill Clinton's political imagination and the political courage that he exhibited 30 years ago in embracing this concept. And believe me, he took a lot of heat for doing it, as I think many of us on this call and on this webinar did. So I think it's fitting that we kick this webinar off with a message from President Clinton. Then my colleague Tressa Pankovits, who is co-director of the Reinventing Schools project, will take over, introduce our very distinguished guest speakers, and run the discussion. So without further ado, thank you all for joining us today, and over to President Clinton.
I'm so glad to join all of you today as you commemorate the 30th anniversary of America's very first charter school law and look ahead to the future. I thank Will Marshall and the Progressive Policy Institute for hosting today's discussion. And I have to acknowledge my longtime friend, Ember Reichgott-Young, who was the author of that very first charter school statute in Minnesota in 1992. I'll always be proud to have signed the federal charter program into law in 1994 to bring charters into more communities and to reach more students, especially in low-income areas. And I'm deeply inspired by all the children who were educated in schools that opened when I was president to overcome obstacles. They've gone on to achieve amazing things. So on this milestone, it's important to look back and be grateful, and to look at what's worked and what hasn't worked so well, so we can continue to innovate and improve America's charter schools and our education system as a whole. I've said many times that I completely believe, whether it's at a public school, a private school, or a charter school, there's hardly any education challenge in America that hasn't been solved by someone somewhere. The problem remains that we haven't been able to fully replicate excellence. So we need to increase the cooperation and partnership between charters and public schools so that we can keep delivering better outcomes and give all our students the opportunities to thrive, no matter who they are, what they look like, where they live, or where they go to school. I hope you'll have a productive conversation about that and many other things that will lead to brighter tomorrows for all our kids and keep America in the future business. Congratulations on doing that for 30 years. And good luck for 30 more. Thanks.
And we certainly appreciate former President Clinton giving us his time to send that greeting. It really means a lot to all of us who are in the thick of this work. And he's very right when he talks about the children being inspiring. I was actually this morning in a partnership school, which is autonomously run by a nonprofit here in Fort Worth, Texas, where I happen to be. And I was in that school this morning. It was the last day of school, and I got to watch the first graders in what was just 4 years ago, perhaps one of the lowest performing schools in the entire state of Texas. And there they were, pre-K through 5 this morning, bright and shiny on their last day of school, singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And their MAP scores are coming back, and they are on track to meet standards. So quite an accomplishment. And for those of us who work in this sector but don't get to visit schools very often, if there's a way you can find to visit a charter school and see this work in action, it will really renew your passion, increase your energy level, and you see how hard the educators are working to turn some of these low performing schools around, and you see the kids that are affected by it, and that's why we're all in this work. So with that said, Ember has been somewhat extensively introduced, but I want to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves, and I'd like to show Ember's book. I've been reading this in preparation for today, and it's really great. So Ember, why don't you tell us what you've been doing since you got that first charter school law passed?
Well, first of all, thank you, Tressa, for that story, and thank you to PPI and the 74 for hosting this discussion to honor the 30th anniversary and hopefully to inform the future of chartering. So when I was a state senator, I worked with Ted Coldery, Joe Nathan, and many others to author the first charter school law in Minnesota and the nation. And though chartering was supported by 2/3 of Americans for many years, I became concerned about the mistruths that were coming up from both the right and the left. And so I decided to record the origins in my book, Zero Chance of Passage, But in that research, I discovered the huge role that Will Marshall and Al Fromm of the Democratic Leadership Council, and then candidate and President Clinton, played in the national conversation. I had no idea that they were talking about chartering even before the law passed in Minnesota. I think that's important. They saw it as a centrist, pragmatic form of public school choice that would improve public education, a middle ground between private school vouchers and the status quo. And the national growth of chartering would not have happened without them, and also with the leadership of US Senator Dave Durnberger from Minnesota, a Republican. So when my book was done, I sent all my documents to the Minnesota Historical Society. But what I didn't realize is that to actually read the documents, you had to go to the society, look up the index, get on a little mini forklift in a warehouse to get up to the top shelf, the 16th shelf, to pull down my box of documents. And then you could read them. They weren't digitized, for heaven's sakes. And so I was pleased to partner with Dr. Jim Gunner and the National Charter Schools Institute to create a digital library, which we now call the National Charter Schools Founders Library. And in just 3 years, we've gathered documents from over 20 pioneers and oral histories, many of whom you have heard about today, including Will Marshall and Ted Coldery and Joe Nathan. The library is just getting started. And for those of you who would like to add your charter story in your state, please just let us know. You can go to www.charterlibrary.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, and I really look forward to hearing your perspective as we hear from the other panelists today. And so next, I would like to introduce M. Kariga Rausch, who is the fairly new president and CEO of the National Charter School Authorizers. And that is the organization, I will let him tell you about it, but that is the organization for authorizers that are the entities that are on one side of the charter school contract that give them the right to operate. And so Kariga, I'll let you talk about what you're doing at NACSA.
I appreciate that, Tressa, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be a part of this panel and this discussion. And I'm just so also very thankful for PPI and the 74 for having the wherewithal to put this together. So let me introduce you to the work of NACSA and authorizing by way of a story of the very first charter school that I ever engaged. It was a secondary school in my hometown of Indianapolis, founded by a diverse group of community leaders and ran by a former teacher who also happened to be a Black man. They renovated an old grocery store in a neighborhood that many said was quote unquote challenged, but vowed to be a community anchor for community self-determination and ensuring that the Black students attending were prepared to attend any college university of their dreams. And they did over and over again and created significant reinvestment in that community. Now, what I didn't know at the time is that that school was ultimately made possible by decisions of this thing called the Charter School Authorizer. And actually, my former boss, Bart Peterson, was the mayor of Indianapolis that made that decision and authorized that school. You see, every charter school has an authorizer. Sometimes that's a school district, sometimes it's the State Department of Education, sometimes it's a university, or in my case, it was the mayor of Indianapolis, among many other types of authorizers across the country. As you indicated, Tressa, they are the entities that are responsible for deciding who gets to open new charter schools, holding them accountable for what they promise to achieve for students and families, and if they should continue to serve students. So that means over time, the quality of charter schools in our country at scale has a lot to do with how strong authorizing is. And so NACSA is a nonprofit organization that's focused on strengthening the policies and practices and ideas of authorizing so that more students and communities have access to schools like the one in the neighborhood that I talked about before, can help them achieve their God-given dreams and talents. And so I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm obviously deeply invested because it's really important to reflect on what chartering has gotten right, wrong, and proving what needs to come next.
Thank you. And the work you do is so important. Holding charter schools accountable is what is distinguishes them from other forms of education. And so I look forward to hearing more. Paul, I'm going to turn to you next. And why don't you introduce yourself and talk about your connection to the charter school movement? And I believe you're muted, so you might want to take that off.
Longtime superintendent in 4 large urban districts, also headed the Recovery School District, of course, which rebuilt schools after Hurricane Katrina. All the schools in New Orleans, with the exception of the select enrollment schools, are actually charter schools. But I had the privilege of working with Albert Shanker when we first chartered in Chicago, because he was one of the early advocates for charter schools, by the way. And we actually met with him, and he actually encouraged us to begin. So the American Federation of Labor, particularly the local chapter in Chicago, the late Tom Reese, they were very, very supportive of the things that we did. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you so much, Paul. And you didn't mention that you have sort of the unique distinction of being probably the only person who has chartered an entire city. Of course, because of Hurricane Katrina, there was a desperate need in the rebuilding phase in New Orleans, and all of those schools were chartered. So you oversaw pretty much close to, and is now, a 100% charter school district. And that brings me to our 4th panelist, Miranda Castron in California. And she is doing heavy lifting out there. Tell us about that.
Hi, Tressa. Thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to engage in this conversation. My name, as you said, is Miranda Castron. I am the president and CEO of the California Charter Schools Association, and we are the membership and advocacy organization representing 700,000 students across California who have chosen public charter schools to further their educational goals and aspirations. When it comes to charter schools, I'm so thrilled to be here with Ember in particular, because my charter story began actually about 20 years ago. So not quite as long as a 3 decades of history, but close enough. And my roots in chartering really started prior to the charter experience when I was doing grassroots organizing in the state of Texas. And we saw in the 1990s, and we saw that wave after wave of reform would get swept out with a change in governors, a change in superintendents, a change in principals. And as an immigrant, I came to the US at 17. I was particularly concerned about how do we create permanence and stability in our reforms so that we have the ability to make them stick and not just, deal with the next wave of changes where everything gets swept out. So I came to California from Texas in 2000 and fell in love with public charter schools in California, which were about 500 or so at the time, and really understood that we are creating community-rooted institutions. With my background in organizing, the whole issue about who we are and who we represent has remained at the forefront of my questioning and work and diligence in keeping this fight up.
And you are doing an amazing job with always big fights on your hands in California. So starting with Ember, you were the author of the first charter schools we've talked about. How did you actually land on charter schools as, in your opinion, the best way to reinvent education? And do you still feel that way?
Well, I do feel that way, yes. I feel it's a good way, but there are many others as well. And hopefully innovation will continue at all levels. But for me, I'm a policymaker. And so for me, the invention or the reinvention and the innovation was the law itself, the policy itself, not so much the school. It's not a school. Chartering is not a school. So to me, in 1991, the innovation truly was passing a law that would allow parents and teachers to create something new. In that time as today, not every child is being served well by traditional district schools. Some children were falling through the cracks, and many of whom were low income and were children of color. And the chartering law allowed the opportunity for ordinary citizens like you and me, parents and teachers, to try something new, something different, without the constraints of the traditional school system. Sometimes the best thing we can do as public officials is to step back, remove the barriers, and let citizens take the lead and be held accountable for results. Chartering comes with accountability measures that are not present for district charters or for district schools. And I like to say that chartered schools trade regulation for results. Now, three visionaries, to your question, Tressa, three visionaries influenced me to create the chartering law. The first was Democratic Governor Rudy Perpich, who proposed open enrollment to a firestorm of protests, and he opened the door to chartering. And once we had open enrollment where people could go to any school district, other public school district in the state, the question was this: we had more access to choices, but what if we didn't have different choices to access? And what if they weren't in my own neighborhood? I don't have money to get across town on a bus. And so we needed more choices in our neighborhood. The second visionary was, as Paul suggested, AFT President Al Shanker, who came to Minnesota in 1988 to tell us about something called charter schools, which is the first place I ever heard the term. And his idea of chartering was about providing teachers with that opportunity to take leadership, to be the professionals who they were, to try new ideas, to be leaders in the classroom. He said at the Itasca seminar that the districts could take their students for granted. And he was right. There was no force for change. Now, later, we diverged in the sense that he wanted those new charter schools within collective bargaining, and we wanted a little more autonomy as charter advocates. But still, he was a very innovative leader. And finally, and there was a question in the chat on this, the name of the group that created the first law, that wrote it, was the Citizens League, which was a community group of urban leaders, civic leaders, labor, business, all coming together saying, we want to improve education. See, chartering came from outside the political system. A lot of people don't realize that. Now, it was a pretty rocky road over 3 years. And frankly, it was so compromised when it passed that I was devastated. I cried and I thought a charter school would never happen. But I was wrong. One of the key things that allowed it to pass is that it was bipartisan. And I think that's just critical for today's discussion. On the most critical vote, where it passed by 3 votes in the House of Representatives, the vote was 56% of the minority House Republicans, 42% of the majority Democrats, with the majority Speaker of the House Democrat voting for it. Note that the Speaker of the House allowed chartering to prevail, even though it was not the will of the governing party. This is a critical element, not just of chartering, but of democracy. So I'll leave that with you now, Tressa. Maybe you want to continue or ask a follow-up. I'd be happy to help you.
I am actually going to throw it to Mirna because, as you said, it was very bipartisan. Progressives were very much invested in chartering. David Osborne, our founding director at Reinventing America's Schools, along with my predecessor, Emily Langhorne, published a report called The Progressive Roots of Charter Schools. And we know that it was bipartisan. Kariga referred to Indianapolis, where there was a real bipartisan effort there. So Mirna, you are of the people on the panel probably most involved in the political fights. And it just seems like it never ends for you in California. So what's changed since the time that Ember passed the first law and this erosion of bipartisanship around trying to make brighter futures for children?
Well, it's certainly not something that happened overnight. We know that, of course, we've had strong support at the federal level and leadership from consecutive administrations, but certainly at the state level. And the same is true in California with consecutive governors at least 3 administrations back that have been very supportive of charter schools. But like so much in our current politics, the polarization and extreme partisanship that have impacted education politics, and not for the good. Add to that, in the state of California, a trend of declining enrollment, which also built up over time, real serious budget pressures across districts that impacted by that declining enrollment, combined with charter school strength and growth. As I mentioned, we serve 700,000 students around more than 1,300 schools across California, and a little over 10% of enrollment. It's not a surprise at all that the competition and the opposition has become formidable. Just in this first phase of our legislative session, we're about at the halfway mark, we've already fought and won yet another existential battle to preserve charter autonomy and flexibility and funding. And we won this fight in this leg of the legislative session because of an unprecedented mobilization of families, teachers, and leaders across the state to resist the efforts to eliminate the things that make charter strong, to make us more like them, those pillars of chartering, like autonomy and flexibility and responsiveness. So it's not long ago that charters were widely recognized for its positive benefit to historically underserved students, and that was, that was the bedrock of why we enjoyed strong bipartisan support. But in recent years, there's been a nonstop campaign of misinformation that is intensive and intentional by labor unions that have divided the education community and elected officials by creating this false choice of us versus them, of zero-sum games that really hurt the very people we are supposed to serve, children. Our task at CCSA is not only to ensure that we keep public education opportunities available to every student in every family in every community, but that we present the facts and successes of charter public schools and lead with the voices of our community. Our charters are public and free and open to all. Surprisingly, so many people do not understand that yet. And we are committed to delivering a high quality education regardless of a student's race, gender, religion, LGBTQ identification, or test course. We also know that the more that the public learns, Tessa, about what charter public schools are, the greater public support we get. In fact, recently, poll after poll shows that Black and brown families overwhelmingly support having strong public charter schools available in their communities, schools that meet them where they are and challenge systemic generational barriers to success to create generational opportunity. Our opponents know this too. And so instead of partnering with us to support students and families, they've taken the route of negative campaigning to try to eliminate what they see as competition. So that's part of the challenge. How do we reframe our movement from competition is always going to exist. It's embedded into the DNA of what we do. But how do we reach for what President Clinton identified as a new horizon for collaboration? Not either or, but how do we broaden that? We must constantly remind ourselves who we are and who we serve, and advocate for the right of every single child to have a good public education, whether they are enrolled in a charter school or a district operated school. That's the premise of our movement, until every child.
So Miranda, just real quick, how do we, the opponents to charter schools are highly organized, very cohesive, very funded, well-funded. Our organization by its nature is more organic. You know, we have groups here, we have groups there. We don't have central necessarily meeting places all the time. How do we create a stronger, more united lobbying group, if you will, for lack of a better word?
Well, I learned long ago in my organizing years that power comes in two ways: organized people or organized money. Our opponents have been particularly successful as painting us as the money people, which in fact, it's exactly the opposite. When you compare the amount of resources that our opponents deploy to oppose us, it's actually a very different story. But we have to get better simply at continuing to connect to our grassroots roots, our assets, our families, our constituencies. We have to keep reminding the public that what we are doing is working, telling our stories through the faces and voices of our students and families, and making sure that we're also building allies. I think in some ways, our charter sector as political actors has been very narrow in their focus around fighting only around policy changes that impact our immediate interests of chartering. But the reality of is that especially as we saw in this pandemic, right? That's not how everyday citizens live their lives. People don't have issues, they have lives. And so we have to continue to connect with how our charters are impacting communities from the bottom up, strengthening grassroots, amplifying the messages, taking our responsibility seriously to educate the public about what we are and who we serve. And so recognizing also that proximity matters. Our schools that are on the ground serving our students can't rely on advocacy organizations like us, like Carigas, to tell that story and to do that fight. It's time for all of us to suit up and defend what we know we are doing right in our neighborhoods.
And that makes me want to talk to Cariga, because his organization is all about ensuring that charters do the right thing. But yet we know that that doesn't always happen. And I've had a couple questions in the Q&A about charter school scandals. And so I also want to refer to something that was published in the 74 Million just this last week. Chester Finn and Bruno Mano wrote a look back and a look forward from charter schools at 30. And to quote from that, paraphrase rather from that, not enough attention was paid to authorizing, governance, and quality control. We focused on quantity rather than quality, assuming that barely regulated marketplace would provide more assurances of school quality than it has. That is partly because we've learned that not everyone who wants to start a school knows or cares how to do it well. So my question to you, Cariga, as the new head of NACSA, how does our sector take a stronger stand on accountability and balance that with the quest for growth?
Boy, I appreciate that question, Tressa. And I suppose we should probably start by just stating an incontrovertible truth. And that's right. Abuse of the public trust is unacceptable anywhere, whether that is in charter schools, district-run schools, or any other space where adults are engaging kids. It's very important that when we see these breaches of public trust, that we root those folks out and remove them from the work that we're doing, period. Now, finding the right balance of oversight while maximizing the time educators can spend on teaching and learning, that is absolutely a space in the charter movement that we've not quite gotten right at scale yet. And that's why we see, I think, uneven performance of charters across the country. We have some places where charters are so overly regulated that they can't do anything innovative or interesting. Some places where they're just, operating without much oversight kind of happening, and a lot where they're finding the right balance, right? But that's a part of why we see this. But that's why I'm also glad, right, from federal to state governments to even some philanthropic organizations, that we're starting to see some investments in developing the smart oversight and those who will carry it out. It's not necessarily about more oversight or less oversight. It's about what's the right oversight that can allow for the creativity and innovation to occur while still maintaining the public trust that schools are run properly. But I'd also be remiss, Tress, if I didn't also say this, and that's since we're talking about accountability. And I think that's perhaps the biggest question at the core of accountability right now is this question: what's a good school? How do we know? And who gets to decide? It strikes me that, right, the world is different, right, with very different demands and expectations right now. And the pandemic, racial awakening, and so many other things have really fundamentally pushed us to think differently about school quality. And I would say that our ability to create the right kinds of educational opportunities for the future and attract the kinds of people who will not only uphold the public trust, but also to attract more folks of color and those with deep ties to communities that know some things about how to educate kids, has an awful lot to do with how we define success in schools. So I'd argue that as we're talking about accountability, it's critical that it grows, as Mirna so well said, from the aspirations and needs of local communities, especially those communities that have been overlooked and undervalued, but still have such tremendous assets that need to be engaged. No more doing two communities. We have to co-create with them. Now, it's certainly critical, right, that we ensure that all of our students are literate and numerate. That's still really important. It's also past time that we broaden and hold schools accountable for other school level important outcomes that folks are working on. And yeah, that's going to be really hard to do because I think we've gotten used to a particular way, right, of understanding what a good school is. But as I look to the future, that's going to be really critical for sustainability, attracting the right kinds of people, and having the kind of smart oversight we need for both innovation and public trust.
So we see in some places where charter schools are growing and where states are proactively, not what Mirna is dealing with in California, but where they're making it easier to charter. Iowa just passed some legislation allowing the state to authorize. We saw that West Virginia just became the newest state to pass a charter school law at all. Are you proactively reaching out to these new authorizers or places where they're changing their charter school laws to let them know how important the quality authorizing piece is?
Absolutely. And the importance of setting up an authorizing shop in such a way that it can learn from the successes and mistakes of the last 30 years kind of in this space so that we can accelerate how quality authorizing kind of looks for more and great schools for kids. And one of the most important elements of that, Tressa, is, again, how we understand school quality, but really emphasizing a bedrock principle as we think about school accountability. And that is, we should never hold the school accountable for the quality of education that kids receive prior there, but we absolutely must hold them accountable for how well students grow and thrive while they're there. And that's why most authorizer accountability systems look at both proficiency and growth and kind of grade level progress, et cetera. But especially as we continue to engage students, it's really important that we focus on how well we're growing students over time to a point of standards, and setting an authorizing shop up that understands, appreciates, codifies that, as well as all of the other really important systems that we've learned over the last 30 years. I'm looking at Paul because he's been such an innovator in a lot of these spaces, in a lot of ways, becomes critically important so that we don't make the same stupid mistakes that we made before in this world.
Thank you for calling them out for what they are, stupid mistakes from time to time. And Paul, this naturally flows to you. Kariga mentioned the pandemic, and you're our disaster superhero. Paul Hill, founder of the Center on Reinventing Public Education, wrote earlier this month that there are parallels in the learning loss after Hurricane Katrina to the learning loss from the pandemic. But he also said that the New Orleans model isn't applicable to this crisis. So leaving out the obvious politics, why is chartering a success in some places, and what do we need to do in the wake of this pandemic?
Well, let me respond from a superintendent standpoint. On the micro level, I think Kariga pointed it out. Individual charters are successful when you carefully select the models and you incubate the leadership teams, when you hold those schools accountable, and when you make the determination of renewal based on their performance. And if you stick to those guidelines, you're going to have successful charters. But on a macro level, if one school is successful, but at the expense of other schools, then are you really a success? So I've always viewed charters as a vehicle to expand not only quality school choices, but to remove obstacles to designing schools that benefit kids. Where charters have not been successful in districts on a broad scale is when the creation of charters has created overcapacity, more schools than are needed, and when all the schools are under-enrolled, all the models suffer, when charters have disrupted feeder patterns, when you've had displacements. As you know, I have major problems with schools or charter schools that go in and displace the existing student population. So when I look to models, and I'll tell you, The great success in New Orleans, and there has been great success, is because we did none of that. We did not create overcapacity. We did not displace. In fact, all the public schools that converted to charters with those same students. So there was no displacement. Our ability to avoid doing those things is the reason for our great success. When you look at, for example, the charter failings in Detroit, they ended up creating twice the number of schools that they had for half of the population that they were previously serving. When you look at the first Baton Rouge reforms versus the second Baton Rouge, Louisiana reforms, in the first reforms, they opened charter schools. Many of the charter schools were middle schools. They disrupted feeder patterns. They created overcapacity. In the second reforms, they did it right. So I've always viewed charters on a macro level as a vehicle for expanding choice, for dealing with overcrowding issues, for strategically providing for certain needs, always guarding against creating overcapacity, and always guarding against the displacement of children, which can be very disruptive in the community. So there's lessons to be learned and there's lessons to be followed.
And
I might add to the discussion, if I might, is that when we started the work with chartering, we were thinking that not only would it be about improving education for the charter public schools, but for the whole system, that in fact it would affect everyone, right? It would lift all public school boats, if you will. And we have seen that in a number of jurisdictions, like in Washington, D.C. And so today in the debate, I would love to see more of the sectors talking to each other and learning from each other, the charter sector and the district sector, and doing that in ways that are common to all, like, for example, personalized learning. We can all learn from that, benefiting from the lessons learned in the learning loss era that we just had, and also the whole idea of teacher-powered schools, which can occur both in charters and in district schools, and has been one of the innovations that really has come out of it, particularly starting in Minnesota. In fact, one of the things I'm most happy about as a union endorsed Democrat is that we had the first union initiated charter school authorizer in the country in Minnesota in 2011. And they're now authorizing 25 charter public schools that give that freedom and autonomy to teachers. So all of this brings us together, I would hope, for the future.
Tressa, I wanted to make one comment very quickly. If you look at the innovation schools, sometimes they're called Renaissance school models, that you're seeing in Camden, that you're seeing in Indianapolis, that you're seeing in Denver. This is a situation where they've gone into the neighborhoods, they've worked with the neighborhoods, they've taken failing schools, they've transformed those schools into charter schools with no displacement of children. That is where you're having great success, because you don't create overcapacity, you're creating quality choices, and you're basically getting the community to embrace the model, because what you're doing is you're replacing a weak school model with a superior school model that has fewer of the obstacles to, in effect, designing schools, whether it's a longer school day or longer school year, to benefit kids. So there are clearly breakthrough models out there that are well worth replicating, particularly in urban areas.
So I know a lot about partnership, innovation, Renaissance schools, whatever you would like to call them. David Osborne and I co-authored an innovation schools guide last year. We published it in October. You can find it on our website. And if you're interested by what Paul's talking about, but not really sure what he's talking about, go read our innovation schools guide. And it also has model legislation. And I'm doing some further reporting on that subject. That's what I'm doing here in Texas this week. Like I said, that school this morning was so inspiring. It was fantastic. So now I want to turn towards, we're a little over time, so I'm just going to caution y'all to keep your answers a little bit tighter for me, because I want to be sure we cover everything. But I want to devote this next section of our webinar to equity issues, because equity in education is so central to the charter school legacy of the last 30 years. And we've also had some questions in the chat around equity and diversity. So I want to start with Kariga on this one. In the promo for this video that the 74 Million produced, you said, charter schools' most important impact on public education has been putting to bed forever, once and for all, the tired and racist notion that some kids cannot succeed at exceptionally high levels. Can you expand on that and talk about the nexus between that and the charter school sector?
Absolutely. So, probably come as no surprise, but important to say it directly, that the belief that some kids can't learn, are not college material, or only see communities as deficits is real, and exists. But I am really thankful that I am part of a sector of schools, a lot of charter schools whose very existence is predicated on demonstrating what Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other lower income kids can achieve. And they're showing every single day, particularly in urban locales, what's possible when you reject deficit notions, remove barriers, provide supports, and raise expectations. Now, it's also true that there are some charters that are getting it wrong, and reifying inequitable education that need to be held to account. No doubt about that. But I think it is an incontrovertible truth now, due in large part by the success of many charter schools in urban areas, as referenced by many different reports, Credo, et cetera, that Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other students of color are achieving at incredibly high levels. And that has a lot to do with putting this belief gap to bed forever.
I like to share the story of a charter school in Minnesota called the Friendship Academy for the Arts, which was a blue ribbon national school just several years ago. That school is located in South Minneapolis. It is 98% African American. They say it's about expectations that made it that blue ribbon national school. What else is interesting about that school? It's located 1 mile from where George Floyd was killed. So that community truly is educating the leaders for the future. And in my feeling for the future has to be that we do have to have those expectations, that we don't see that enough in our district schools. And we also need to see more teachers of color. And the child in the charter school, according to the National Alliance data, has more chance to have a teacher of color. I also finally just want to acknowledge Joe Nathan's comments in the chat, where he points out that the first person who talked about having an alternative system of education was Dr. Kenneth Clark, who was a Black educational psychologist, and who talked about this back in 1968. And that Rosa Parks was a person who tried to have a charter public school in Detroit, but the Detroit School Board denied her application. So the desire of the African American community and other communities of color for chartering has been great, and was one of my biggest supporters when we tried to pass the law in 1991.
Mirna, in your comments in the promo reel, you talked about innovation being in our DNA because kids' lives depend on it. Your demographics in California are very heavily Black and Brown. What do you say to your opponents who just don't get it?
Well, certainly our ability to continue to focus our stories and amplify our message and broadly to who we are and who we serve is of paramount importance. We cannot say it too often that our charter schools are really closing generational opportunity gaps into creating generational change. Karika was talking about the work that so many of our charter schools are doing to really intentionally increase the pipeline of leaders of color to come back to communities, to come back to the charter schools that they graduated from. And many of our charter organizations are doing a great job at looking well beyond just the K-12 arc of the experience that our students are living to really think carefully about those systems that require a longer view for how we are really building social capital in our communities and really amplifying those learnings. I also want to acknowledge a comment Crease put in the chat, that often we talk in our charter family only about the charter impacts, but it's a very undertold story that in the second largest district in the nation, LA Unified, the strength and robustness of the charter sector here has really transformed in many ways the ways that families perceive and ask for choice, and how the district over time has really responded to that. For example, LAUSD has massive wave of magnet schools and specialized programs. And there's no longer a question whether in Los Angeles, families do vote with their feet and are looking for greater options. Tessa, you're absolutely right that in California, the charter schools we serve at CCSA are enrolling close to twice as many, the proportion of Black students, as the rest of the state. Our families know who we are. Our families know why we lead, and we need to continue to place a focus on those stories, amplify the successes, and push back really, really hard on this notion that our success comes on the backs of vulnerable students. You certainly do not rip opportunity away from the most vulnerable students in order to make excuses for that in broad scale still continues to make itself unaccountable.
Yes, that's very, very important. And I was going to ask Paul a question about, are we innovating enough? But we actually have a question in the chat that is in that same theme. And then I'm going to ask Kariga to follow up Paul's comment. And what the audience member says is that over 30 years of the charter school sector, they see charter schools looking more and more like traditional schools. Now, they feel that's because of over-regulation by the authorizer. But Paul, I was originally going to ask you whether it was enough variety of models. David Osborne feels very strongly that because no two children are the same, we should have as many school models as possible. So Paul, to you first, are we innovating enough? What's the next frontier in innovation in the charter sector? And Korea, is there over-authorizing that's over-regulation by authorizing that's stifling?
Well, I don't think we're innovating enough, and I don't think charters have had the same success at the high school level that they've had at the elementary school level. But it's incumbent upon superintendents and educational leaders to demand innovation. Let me give you a case in point. In Chicago, we wanted to, at least in the 90s, when we began to do our charters, we wanted to solicit charter proposals that would allow us to deal with what I call our alternative school population. Those individuals who had gotten incarcerated, those individuals who had gotten kicked out of school, et cetera. So we created the Alternative Schools Network, and a group of 30 community schools that served the displaced population. I'm talking about students aged from 17 to 21 who had dropped out, who had been released from incarceration. We did the military and first responder academies, if you recall. These were actually, most of them were actually union charters, where the union gave us carte blanche to design schools and to really open them up like charters. And they're incidentally, they're overwhelmingly minority, and they're overwhelmingly low income, and not one of them is a underperforming school. And many of the schools, the one in New Orleans, for example, is one of the top non-select enrollment schools in the community. So you have to drive innovation. For example, there's a huge gap in work-study high schools like Cristo Rey. Originally, the plan was for Cristo Rey school that opened in Illinois to become a charter school, but of course the archdiocese blocked that. And now there's 35 Cristo Rey schools. They serve overwhelmingly the minority community, and those schools are extraordinarily successful. They're high performing, and the children go to work while they're going to college, and while they're going to high school. And it's not that they're trying to steer them into a profession, but rather they want them to be college prepared while at the same time occupationally proficient. So again, we have to drive innovation. If we drive innovation, the charter community, the education community, the innovation community will respond.
Thanks, Paul. And Kariga, did you remember what I asked about whether there were over regulating?
Yeah. I would say it depends on Instead, we talk about kind of a national charter school work. This is really 45 different state charter school works, because I think it depends on where you're at. In some places, absolutely true that charters are woefully overregulated. Some places they're underregulated, some places they're figuring out and having it just right. And so that is a space, again, we've gotten partially right. We got to get better at scale in our work, no doubt. But I would also add that our narrow understanding of what a good school is also kind of stifling our ability to think creatively and innovatively, which importantly, by the way, that doesn't mean that we get rid of expectations for numeracy and literacy. I am deeply concerned with efforts right now to get rid of current measures of literacy and numeracy. And I'm deeply concerned about that because for a long time, folks that look like me were telling a whole lot of people that our kids were not getting the same level of education that other kids, were getting, and nobody believed us until we had comparable ways of showing, no, this isn't, even in some of our best public schools, kids who look like me, low income kids and others, weren't getting the same shot as other kids. So a broader understanding of what a good school isn't diminishing our expectation for literacy and numeracy, but it is saying there's more that schools are trying to accomplish that we need to acknowledge so that we can get more innovative, creative ways that can drive equity and get more interesting kinds of people of color, those with deep ties to communities, into the work that we're doing.
Yeah, that's right. And I want to take a minute to mention that Curtis Valentine, my colleague, co-director, is going to be doing another webinar coming up in a couple weeks, I think, on the next 30 years of chartering and what the movement needs. And he is going to focus very much on young Black and Brown voices who are pioneering the work going forward from today. So I hope everybody that's here and in line with Kariga's answer there will be on the lookout for that, save the date for that event. Okay, so we're almost out of time. We've got about 2.5 minutes, but we got such a great question. It was actually submitted in advance. So I apologize to the audience. We did not get to all of your questions, but I will send them off to our panelists, and hopefully we'll find a way to post those answers. But the question that came in was from Julia Westwick. Half of the studies I read show that charters improve student achievement and half show that they do not. It seems that those on each side of the charter debate are operating on a completely different set of facts. Why is this? Are studies biased? What is the truth? And as I said, we have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to, Paul, you can start, but I want everybody to get a chance to answer that.
Tressa, the data is clear. When you look at demographics, the charters do far better with minority children. Facts, hands down, no debate. It's there's this tendency to compare apples to oranges rather than apples to apples. So at the end of the day, that's not the case. But let me make one significant point. When you look at those studies and you look at charters that have had success, as well as traditional public schools that have success, there are certain constant common characteristics. And one is instructional time on task. Maybe the reason that the New Orleans charters were successful, or the charters in other communities have been successful, is because 30-40% more instructional time on task. And what charters do is charters do not have the obstacles that restrict the length of the day, the length of the year. It's not only staffing, it's not only models, but it's the amount of instructional time you spend to help children get caught up.
And Mirna was vigorously nodding over there, so I think you have something to add.
You might have guessed that, Tressa. Yes. Well, I completely second what Paul said. Absolutely right. And we're seeing actually in this moment of the pandemic, talk about a research moment, right? To see how the different sectors responded to this moment. There's no question that instructional time was held at significantly higher levels in charter schools than in traditional schools. All those studies are about to come. The researchers are putting a final note on those results, but I've data and it's there. But in addition to the instructional time here, I completely agree with my friend Kariga that broadening the sense of what is a good school is really important. In this moment of the pandemic, charter schools rose to the challenge because they took student and seriously. When
Mhm.
districts couldn't find thousands of students, charter schools were retaining attendance at 96 to 98%. That is our secret sauce, ensuring that the communities that we're building, the learning communities that we're building, really are spaces for embracing our students where they are. And yes, that is instructional, but it's also about how we show up for them.
That's right. And right now, there's always new trends and new hot topics in public education. And right now you hear a lot of people talking about community schools. We want community schools. I have yet to visit a charter or an innovation or a partnership or a Renaissance school. Now, I certainly haven't visited all of them, but I have yet to visit one of those schools that doesn't operate as a community school, where they aren't digging deeper. They aren't making those relationships. They aren't finding out what's going on at home and filling needs as they go. So to those who would say, forget charter schools, let's go with community schools, I would say you haven't taken a close enough look at a lot of the charters that are out there. We are out of time. I am out of breath. I want to thank everybody. I wish we had 2 more hours to go, but we don't want to wear people out. And we will try to get questions that were submitted by the audience answered. And thank you all for all of your work. Ember, thank you for starting us off 30 years ago, and we're going strong. So we'll see you all later. And thanks to everyone in the audience who attended.